Hello, welcome to the Breaking Barriers, Inspiring Stories channel. Subscribe to the channel to always follow our stories. Attention, this is a fictional story. The events of this story did not really happen. It is just a fantasy about overcoming. Isabel Martins always knew the road to the top wouldn't be easy. At 42, she had shattered multiple barriers, becoming one of the youngest judges in her city and, without a doubt, the first black woman to hold such a position. To outsiders, Isabel was a symbol of strength and success, but behind that determined exterior lay years of quiet struggle against racism and prejudice. She came from humble beginnings. Raised by a single mother who worked as a house cleaner, Isabel understood from an early age what it meant to sacrifice just to get by. Nothing in life comes for free, her mother used to say. With that mindset, Isabel threw herself into her studies. She spent countless nights studying, always with a clear goal: to graduate with a law degree. Her dream of becoming a judge wasn't something she shared easily, knowing how the world viewed her. People like us don't make it that far, she'd been told more than once. But Isabel never let that stop her. Now, sitting behind her imposing desk in the courthouse, she looked over the stacks of files in front of her. Each case that crossed her desk carried emotional weight. She knew that the justice she administered would affect lives, and that was a heavy burden, but one she carried with pride. Isabel had the power to shape people's fates, and she always strove to be fair and impartial. However, within the courthouse walls, Isabel could feel the stares. Sometimes they were subtle, like offhand comments left hanging in the air. Other times, they were more direct, with older, white colleagues openly questioning how a black woman had managed to climb so high. "It must have been quotas," some would whisper, without even bothering to hide their words. Isabel, though, brushed off these murmurs. She had trained herself to be strong, to not let these insinuations disrupt her focus. But sometimes it was hard. On the tougher days, when the piles of cases seemed never-ending and the pressure kept building, she would find herself questioning if she truly belonged in this space. Outside the courtroom, Isabel led a simple life. She was married to Miguel, a history teacher who had supported her through every step of her journey. He understood the weight Isabel carried each day, and despite his own struggles in the academic world, he was always the first to make sure she had what she needed. They didn't have children, a decision they'd made so Isabel could focus on her career. Sometimes, she wondered if that had been the right choice, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. At home, Miguel often reminded her of her importance. "You're changing the system from within, Isabel. What you do matters," he'd say, his voice steady and reassuring, especially on the days when the courthouse's hostile environment made her feel like she was drowning. Isabel knew the path she had chosen wasn't easy. For a black woman in that space, every decision was scrutinized more intensely. While other judges could make mistakes and be given a simple pat on the back, she knew she didn't have that luxury. Every ruling she made, every word she spoke, was dissected under a magnifying glass. Still, she remained firm because she believed in what she was doing. One Monday morning, as Isabel arrived at the courthouse, she found a stack of new cases waiting on her desk, as usual. One case, in particular, caught her attention. It involved corruption charges against powerful local politicians. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with something like this, but as she flipped through the documents, she felt a chill down her spine. Something about this case felt off, something that made her think it would be more difficult than usual. She pushed the feeling aside and continued reading. Isabel knew that handling cases like these was always a challenge. The more powerful the people involved, the more attention the case drew. But that didn't intimidate her. She was determined to stick to her principles, administering justice, no matter who sat in the defendant's chair. And so, that day, Isabel entered the courtroom with the same calm and confident demeanor she always had, ready for yet another trial. Little did she know, that would be the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. The day had started like any other. Isabel entered the courtroom, her face composed as always, ready to tackle the list of cases that awaited her. But today felt different, like there was a storm brewing just below the surface. She noticed the whispers, the sideways glances from her colleagues as she walked by. It wasn't unusual for people to talk behind her back. Being a black woman in a position of power meant that criticism and judgment followed her everywhere. Still, something felt off. Isabel pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. The corruption case she had been reading about all week was scheduled for the afternoon session. As she prepared, she mentally ran through the facts of the case. The defendants were high-ranking officials, influential in the local political scene, and the allegations against them were serious. Bribes, cover-ups, shady dealings. It was a web of deceit that would take careful unraveling. Isabel knew she had to be thorough, fair, and above all, unflinching in her pursuit of justice. As the day went on, that uneasy feeling stayed with her. She sat through the morning hearings, listening to arguments, making rulings, but her mind kept drifting back to the whispers. Something was happening. What was it that everyone else seemed to know, but she didn't? The answer came during the lunch break. As Isabel sat at her desk, going over the afternoon's docket, her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Judge Martins," she said, her voice hesitant. "There's something you need to see." Isabel looked up, sensing the tension in the room. "What is it?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Her assistant handed her a folded newspaper. Isabel's heart sank as she read the headline, "Judge Martins under investigation for corruption." For a moment, the room spun. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the paper. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice low and strained. Her assistant looked at her with wide eyes, clearly shaken. "It just came out this morning. The district attorney's office is accusing you of accepting bribes in exchange for lenient sentences." Isabel's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She had always prided herself on her integrity, her fairness. How could anyone accuse her of something so vile? Her reputation, her career, it was all on the line. And worse, the very system she had dedicated her life to was now turning against her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I need to speak with my lawyer," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Isabel sat through the corruption trial she was supposed to preside over, but her mind was elsewhere. As soon as the court adjourned, she rushed out of the building, ignoring the reporters who had already begun to gather outside. At home, Miguel was waiting for her, having seen the news on TV. His face was a mix of concern and disbelief. "Isabel, what's going on?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her the moment she walked through the door. "I don't know," she whispered, burying her face in his chest. "They're saying I took bribes. It's a lie, Miguel. I didn't do any of it." "I know you didn't," he said firmly. "We're going to fight this." That night, they sat together at the kitchen table, making phone calls, contacting lawyers, trying to figure out where these accusations had come from. It didn't take long to realize that this wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a setup. Someone wanted Isabel out of the way, and they were willing to destroy her career to do it. As the days passed, the media frenzy grew. Headlines splashed her name across the front pages, linking her to scandals and corruption. The court issued an official statement, announcing that Isabel had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Her name, once associated with justice and fairness, was now mired in scandal. Isabel was devastated. Everything she had worked for, all the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the struggles, it all felt like it was unraveling before her eyes. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Who was behind these accusations? And why? The worst part was watching the way people responded. Some of her colleagues, who had once smiled and congratulated her on her achievements, now avoided her altogether. They didn't say it, but Isabel knew what they were thinking. She's guilty. After all, for many of them, it had always been hard to believe that a black woman could rise so high without cutting corners. But Isabel refused to give in to despair. She had fought her whole life to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to let it all crumble because of a lie. She would fight this with everything she had. Late one night, as Isabel sat alone in the living room, she stared out the window, watching the rain fall. Her heart ached, but deep down, she knew the truth would come out. It had to. "I'm going to clear my name," she whispered to herself, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I didn't come this far just to let them tear me down." The next morning, Isabel woke up with a sense of resolve. The storm swirling around her wasn't going to disappear overnight. But she knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for the truth to surface on its own. She had to fight for it. She had to prove her innocence, not only for herself, but for every person who looked up to her, who believed in her journey. She and Miguel met with her lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Daniel Cruz, who had dealt with high-profile cases before. Daniel had a calm, calculating demeanor, the kind of presence that reassured Isabel even when everything felt chaotic. "I've been going over the details," Daniel said, flipping through a file as they sat in his office. "There's no hard evidence linking you to any bribes, just witness statements. But we both know how dangerous that can be. These people, whoever they are, have planted just enough doubt to cast a shadow over your career." Isabel leaned forward, her hands clasped together tightly. "Who's behind this, Daniel? There has to be a reason. This feels personal." "It might be," Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "You've made some powerful enemies, Isabel, especially with the corruption cases you've handled recently. There are plenty of people who'd benefit from seeing you fall." The weight of his words settled over Isabel like a heavy blanket. She had always known that her position made her a target, but she had never imagined someone would go this far. It was one thing to face casual racism and microaggressions in the workplace, but to be framed for something so damaging, that was another level of cruelty. "We need to start building a case of our own," Daniel continued. "We'll need to gather every piece of evidence that shows you've always acted with integrity. We'll also need to find out who's spreading these lies and why." Miguel, who had been sitting quietly next to Isabel, finally spoke up. "Is there any way to get ahead of this? To stop it before it gets worse?" Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The court of public opinion is already forming its judgment. The media is running with the story, and people are going to believe what they want to believe. But we can still fight this. We just have to be smart." As the meeting wrapped up, Isabel left Daniel's office feeling both overwhelmed and determined. She knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't about to give up. She had worked too hard and come too far to let it all be taken away from her now. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Isabel had ever faced. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of suspicion hanging over her. Reporters camped outside her home, waiting for a statement that she refused to give. In public, she noticed the way people looked at her, their eyes filled with doubt and judgment. The whispers were louder now, more direct. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unsure of where they stood. Even in moments of solitude, Isabel couldn't escape the cloud of uncertainty that surrounded her. She had never felt so isolated, so betrayed by the system she had dedicated her life to upholding. But through it all, Miguel remained her rock, constantly reminding her the truth. "They can say whatever they want, Isabel," he would tell her during their long, quiet evenings at home. "But we know who you are. The people who truly matter know who you are." Still, the emotional toll was undeniable. Every day felt like a new battle, and Isabel could feel the strain beginning to wear her down. The worst part was the not knowing. Who's behind all of this? And why had they chosen her as their target? One afternoon, after yet another day of trying to piece together the puzzle, Isabel sat down at the dining room table, exhausted. Miguel came over, handing her a cup of tea and sitting across from her. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant. "Maybe it's time to look into your old cases, the ones that involve people with a lot of power. There could be a connection there." Isabel looked up, surprised. She hadn't considered that possibility yet, but as she thought about it, it made sense. Some of the cases she had ruled on in recent years had involved high-profile defendants, politicians, businessmen, people who had a lot to lose if they were found guilty. "That's a good idea," she said slowly, her mind racing. "But where do we even start? There were so many cases." "Start with the ones where you really shook things up," Miguel suggested. "The ones where your rulings had a big impact on powerful people." Isabel nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. And right now, any lead was better than none. That night, Isabel and Miguel pored over old case files, searching for any clue that might point them in the right direction. They spent hours going through documents, recalling details from trials that had once seemed like distant memories. As the clock ticked past midnight, Isabel finally found something. "Miguel, look at this," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with excitement. She held up a file from a corruption case she had presided over 2 years ago. The defendant had been a wealthy businessman with strong political ties. Isabel had ruled against him, sentencing him to prison. The media had dubbed it one of the biggest scandals of the year. He was furious after the trial, Isabel remembered. His lawyers tried to appeal, but they couldn't overturn the ruling. Miguel frowned. "Do you think he could be behind this?" Isabel's mind raced. It wasn't impossible. The man had the resources, the connections, and certainly the motive, but she needed proof. The next morning, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that they were onto something. That businessman. He had motive, power, and enough influence to make a case against her stick, even if it was built on lies. It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than they had before. She and Miguel decided to dig deeper into his background, hoping to find any thread they could pull to unravel the conspiracy. Over the next few days, Isabel worked tirelessly, combing through public records, old news reports, and anything that could shed light on the businessman's connections. Miguel, always her partner in crime, did the same, reaching out to contacts in the academic world who might know more about the people involved. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. They learned that the businessman Eduardo Costa had ties to several local politicians, many of whom had been implicated in corruption scandals over the years. Some had even been involved in cases Isabel had presided over. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but it still felt like there was something missing. They needed more concrete evidence to tie Eduardo directly to the accusations against Isabel. One evening, as Isabel sat at her desk, reviewing her notes, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel, her lawyer. "We need to meet. I think I've found something." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She immediately called Miguel, and they drove to Daniel's office, the tension building with each passing minute. When they arrived, Daniel was already waiting for them, his face serious. "What is it?" Isabel asked as soon as they sat down. Daniel handed her a folder. "I've been looking into the people who testified against you. 2 of the key witnesses are connected to Eduardo Costa. One of them is a former employee of his company, and the other has ties to a political action committee he funds." Isabel's breath caught in her throat as she flipped through the documents. This was it. This was the connection they had been searching for. But it wasn't enough to prove a conspiracy. They needed something more, something undeniable. "Is there any way we can prove that Eduardo orchestrated this?" Miguel asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking. "It's tricky. We have a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we need something concrete. something that ties him directly to the people who made these accusations. If we can find that, we have a real shot at clearing your name. Isabel nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. She was so close to the truth, she could almost taste it. But she knew that uncovering the final piece of the puzzle wouldn't be easy. Eduardo Costa was powerful, and the people who worked for him would be loyal, especially if they stood to gain something from her downfall. Over the next few days, Isabel, Miguel, and Daniel worked tirelessly to build their case. They interviewed former employees of Costa's company, looking for anyone who might be willing to talk. At first, it felt like they were hitting dead end after dead end. Most people were too scared to speak out, afraid of what might happen if they crossed Eduardo Costa. But then, just when they were starting to lose hope, they got a break. It was a phone call from one of Daniel's contacts, a private investigator who had been looking into Costa's financial records. "I found something interesting," the man said, his voice crackling over the speakerphone. "There's a series of payments made to a few of the witnesses who testified against Judge Martins. The payments are all funneled through a shell company, but the trail leads back to Eduardo Costa." Isabel's heart raced. This was it. This was the proof they needed. "Can you get us those records?" Daniel asked, his tone sharp with urgency. "Already sent them to your email," the investigator replied. "You'll want to move fast on this. If Costa gets wind that you're onto him, he might try to cover his tracks." After the call ended, Isabel sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. They finally had something solid, something they could take to court. But it wasn't over yet. Eduardo Costa was a dangerous man, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. "I think we've got him," Miguel said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "This is enough to clear your name, Isabel. We can finally put this behind us." Isabel nodded, but she knew better than to celebrate just yet. They still had to present their case, and there was no telling how Costa would respond once he realized the walls were closing in on him. That night, as Isabel lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The weight of the past few months had taken its toll on her, but now there was a glimmer of hope. She could feel the tide turning in her favor, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Eduardo Costa wasn't the type of man to go down quietly. He would fight back with everything he had, and Isabel had to be ready for whatever came next. "I'm going to clear my name," she whispered into the darkness, more determined than ever, "no matter what it takes." The trial began with a media frenzy. Reporters crowded the courtroom, their cameras flashing as Isabel entered, her face set with quiet determination. This was the moment she had been dreading, but also preparing for. She wasn't just fighting for her career. She was fighting for her reputation, her dignity, and the truth. Daniel stood at her side, his calm, methodical approach offering a sense of stability in the chaos. Miguel sat behind her, offering silent support. Isabel took a deep breath as the judge called the court to order. This was it. Everything was on the line. The prosecution opened with their case, presenting witness after witness who testified against Isabel. Their claims painted her as a corrupt judge, someone who had taken bribes to rule in favor of criminals. Each accusation felt like a punch to the gut, but Isabel held her head high. She knew the truth, and soon, so would everyone else. When it was Daniel's turn, he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. He poked holes in their arguments, highlighting inconsistencies in the witness testimonies. And then he brought forward the evidence they had uncovered. The payments made to the witnesses funneled through Eduardo Costa's shell company. The courtroom buzzed with shock as Daniel presented the financial records. "These witnesses were paid to lie," he stated, his voice steady but firm. "This entire case is built on a foundation of corruption, orchestrated by a man who had everything to gain from Judge Martin's downfall." Isabel watched as the prosecution squirmed, their case unraveling before their eyes. But she knew they wouldn't give up easily. They tried to argue that the payments were unrelated, that there was no direct proof linking Eduardo Costa to the conspiracy. That's when Daniel called their star witness to the stand, a former employee of Costa's who had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The man's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. "Mr. Costa approached me after the trial didn't go his way," the witness said, his voice shaky but clear. "He was furious about the verdict. He told me he would do whatever it took to ruin Judge Martins. He paid off the witnesses to make sure she would never work again." Isabel's heart raced as the words sank in. This was a moment she had been waiting for. The truth was finally out. The prosecution tried to discredit the witness, but the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge knew it. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Not guilty. Isabel closed her eyes, relief flooding her body. She had won. She had cleared her name. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned silence. Isabel turned to Miguel, who pulled her into a tight hug, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Isabel. You did it." But as the joy of victory settled over her, Isabel couldn't shake the lingering feeling of anger. Yes, she had won, but the damage had been done. Her reputation had been dragged through the mud, her career nearly destroyed. And for what? Because one man couldn't handle losing. As she left the courtroom, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. How does it feel to be vindicated? Do you have a message for Eduardo Costa? Isabel paused, taking a deep breath. The truth always comes out, she said, her voice steady. No matter how much you try to bury it. The trial was over, but Isabel's life was far from back to normal. In the weeks that followed, she struggled to reclaim her sense of peace. The media frenzy died down, but the scars from the ordeal remained. Her career had taken a hit, and while she had been cleared of all charges, the damage to her reputation couldn't be undone overnight. Returning to the courtroom felt different now. The same halls where she once walked with pride now felt like a battlefield. Some colleagues treated her with sympathy, while others still eyed her with suspicion, despite the verdict. It was a painful reminder that, in the court of public opinion, innocence didn't always mean acceptance. Miguel noticed the toll it was taking on her. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, he gently took her hand. Isabel, you need to take some time for yourself. You've been through hell and back. You don't have to go back to work right away. Isabel sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. I know, but I can't just sit here and let everything I've worked for slip away. I need to rebuild. Miguel smiled softly. And you will. But you don't have to do it all at once. Isabel knew he was right. But the drive to prove herself, to show the world that she was still the capable, just judge she had always been, was too strong to ignore. She decided to return to work, but on her own terms. She took on fewer cases, allowing herself the space to heal while slowly rebuilding her reputation. In time, things began to improve. The media moved on to the next scandal, and the whispers of doubt gradually faded. Isabel found herself presiding over important cases again, and with each verdict, her confidence returned. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. But there was one final thing she needed to do. Months after the trial, Isabel received a call she had been waiting for. Eduardo Costa had been arrested on charges of witness tampering and conspiracy. The man who had tried to destroy her life was finally facing justice. Isabel sat in her office, staring at the news report on her computer screen. She had imagined this moment so many times. How it would feel to see him brought down, to know that he would pay for what he had done. But now that it was real, the emotions were more complicated than she had expected. There was satisfaction, of course, relief, but there was also a deep sense of exhaustion. The battle had taken so much from her, And even with Eduardo's downfall, it felt like a hollow victory. A week later, Isabel received an invitation to attend Eduardo Costa's trial. She wasn't required to testify, but the prosecutors wanted her there as a symbol of the case's success. Isabel debated whether or not to go. Part of her wanted to leave the past behind, to move on with her life without revisiting the trauma. But another part of her knew she needed to see this through. On the day of the trial, Isabel walked into the courtroom, her head held high. Eduardo sat at the defense table, looking every bit as arrogant as he had when she had first sentenced him years ago. But this time, the tables had turned. As the trial progressed, Isabel watched as the prosecution laid out the case against him, detailing his attempts to frame her and undermine the justice system. Eduardo sat in silence, his once powerful presence diminished in the face of the evidence against him. When the verdict came in guilty on all counts, Isabel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was over, truly over. As she left the courtroom, she didn't speak to the reporters waiting outside. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. That night, as she sat with Miguel on their porch, looking out at the stars, she finally allowed herself to breathe. The storm had passed. The fight was over. And now, it was time to start living again.